The stench of decay clung to the palace walls. Servants whispered of shadows moving on their own. And England's most iconic monarch, Queen Elizabeth I, sat motionless in a darkened chamber, refusing food, refusing doctors, and speaking to people who weren't there in the next few minutes. You'll uncover the grotesque truth about how the Virgin Queen died, truth that Tudor historians carefully scrubbed from official records. This isn't the polished, dignified tale from your school textbooks. This is a forensic reconstruction based on secret physician notes, eyewitness letters, and modern medical analysis. You're about to learn why Elizabeth stopped changing her clothes for over 10 days, why she stood silently in a cold corner for hours, and why no one dared to speak her name after death, because her final days weren't noble, they were terrifying. Her gums oozed black, her mind unraveled, her courtiers fled the room just to breathe clean air, and yet, even as her body wasted and her mind splintered, her legend endured thanks to a carefully orchestrated cover-up. What really happened in those final weeks at Richmond Palace? What did Elizabeth see in the shadows that made her scream in the night? And why did the royal physicians destroy so many of her medical records? Was it poison from a rival court faction? A psychological collapse beneath the crushing weight of her secrets? Or something even darker, an undiagnosed disease rotting her from within while the Virgin Queen tried to pray the pain away? Stay with me, because what happens next rewrites everything you think you know about Elizabethan history. 3 disturbing revelations await, each more shocking than the last. And if you've never heard this before, help others discover the truth by hitting that like button. What you're about to see has been buried for over 400 years. Until now, it started subtly, so subtly that even her closest advisors didn't recognize it at first. A cough that wouldn't go away, sleepless nights, dark circles beneath eyes once praised for their sparkle. Queen Elizabeth I, the woman who had stood unshakable through assassinations, invasions, and betrayal, began to fade. The first real alarm came in the winter of 1602. Elizabeth was seen walking the gardens at Richmond Palace long past midnight, whispering to herself and shaking her head. Servants claimed she was talking to her late cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, the same woman she had executed 15 years earlier. Court gossip blamed grief, but the royal physician, Dr. Richard Huyck, wrote in a now-lost diary fragment that Her Majesty's mood turns black with little cause, and her thoughts drift unbidden into realms unnatural. But it wasn't just melancholy. Something was eating her from the inside out. Her once radiant skin turned waxy. She grew so thin. Her robes hung off her like curtains. The Queen, famed for her fierce appetite in court banquets, began refusing food entirely. When she did eat, it was with the delicacy of someone in agony, small nibbles of soaked bread, cold broth, and the occasional candied fruit. Even those caused visible discomfort. Her famous voice grew weak and raspy. She rarely spoke above a whisper. The once eloquent speeches that roused armies were replaced by short, breathless mutterings no one could understand. Even ambassadors noted how frail she looked, describing her as more ghost than woman. Stranger still, Elizabeth began to isolate herself from everyone, even her beloved ladies in waiting. She refused to sit. For hours, sometimes entire days, she would stand motionless against the wall of her private chamber, eyes fixed on some point no one else could see. When asked what troubled her, she responded only, "I see the others waiting for me." Then came the dreams, if they were dreams. Servants reported screams echoing from her chamber at night. and once found the Queen collapsed on the floor, clawing at her own arms. She claimed she saw a man made of ash pulling her into a pit of fire. This wasn't stress. This wasn't age. Something deeper was unraveling, and the court, terrified of her wrath, pretended nothing was wrong. But one thing was undeniable. The Virgin Queen was losing her grip and power on reality, and perhaps even on her own body. By early March of 1603, Queen Elizabeth's body had become a map of decline. Her once porcelain skin was now sallow and mottled. The famed white lead makeup that had defined her regal image for decades had fused with her skin, causing chemical burns and open sores around her eyes and mouth. Peeling back the image of power revealed something far more disturbing: patches of raw, inflamed flesh weeping fluid beneath layers of powder. But the most shocking change was her teeth. Elizabeth's smile, once called radiant in love letters from suitors across Europe, had blackened entirely. Rot had taken hold. Her breath reeked of decay. Physicians noted that her gums bled spontaneously, and her teeth were so loose she could barely chew. Meals had to be mashed into a thin paste or dissolved in wine. Even then, she often gagged and spat them out. She began refusing baths. Her ladies-in-waiting attempted to gently clean her with cloth and rose water, but the Queen would recoil violently. Her skin had grown so thin and fragile that even soft linen caused visible pain. Under her gowns, her frame was skeletal. Her bones jutted beneath. The royal fabric sharp against the skin. One courtier wrote, "Her Majesty appears hollowed, like a saint's reliquary. She is still breathing." Her hair, once the vibrant red of her Tudor lineage, had turned sparse and brittle. What was left fell out in tufts. To preserve appearances, a new elaborate wig was fashioned, layered with precious gems. But in private, Elizabeth refused it. She didn't want to be touched, even by those who loved her most. Even more alarming were her rashes. Crimson blotches bloomed across her neck and chest, raised, inflamed, and hot to the touch. Some physicians feared smallpox. Others whispered of cancer. None dared speak openly. She refused all treatment, declaring that God shall decide what to take and what to leave. The Queen's nails thickened and yellowed. Her fingers curled slightly, as if clawing towards something just out of reach. She could no longer walk without assistance, and even then, only a few paces before she trembled uncontrollably and demanded to be left alone. By mid-March, she was rarely seen by anyone. Her bed was stripped of royal bedding and replaced with black cloth. She would lie there awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, refusing sleep, food, prayer, or conversation. Those closest to her were struck not only by her appearance, but by the stench. Despite herbs and perfumes, the air around her bed was thick with a sickly, sweet rot. Her body, it seemed, was beginning to betray her while she still lived, and behind her closed eyes, the visions returned, more vivid than ever. Screaming faces, bleeding children, hands reaching from the shadows. The Queen was no longer dying in her sleep. She was being dragged. By late March 1603. Queen Elizabeth I was no longer ruling England. She was battling phantoms inside her own mind. The hallucinations worsened. At first, she would whisper to unseen figures, glancing toward the corners of her room as if someone stood just beyond the candlelight. Then the whispers turned to arguments. Her voice would rise, strained and hoarse, shouting at the shadows. One servant reported hearing her plead with Robert in the dead of night, believed to be Robert Dudley, her lifelong favorite, dead for 15 years. She became convinced she was being watched. Tapestries were torn from the walls, mirrors shattered. She claimed enemies were spying on her through reflections, plotting her end. Courtiers walked on eggshells. No one contradicted her, not even when she accused her closest ladies of conspiring with Spain, of poisoning her lace collars, of letting the devil into her chamber. Worse still, she forgot who she was. There were days she demanded to be addressed as Anne, the name of her mother, Anne Boleyn. Other times, she insisted she was just a maid in waiting and begged to be dismissed. In one chilling episode, she began reciting her coronation oath over and over, eyes wide, voice trembling. She didn't remember having taken the throne. She didn't remember she already ruled. And yet, within these fractured spells, terrifying lucidity would flash through. She would rise in bed, spine straight as iron, and deliver monologues about England's enemies and divine judgment. She once called for her old armor and sword, claiming she would ride to war again though she could barely lift her head. These moments, though rare, froze the room. It was as if Elizabeth's legendary will was clawing through the illness, trying to reclaim even a fragment of her old self. But each time, the strength slipped away faster. She began to speak of ghosts. She described the dead assembling around her, her mother Anne Boleyn holding her own severed head, Mary Queen of Scots weeping in the corner, and her dozens of executed enemies whispering promises of revenge. No one dared enter her chamber alone. After sunset, worse still, she stopped recognizing people altogether. Her most loyal advisors, Cecil Howard, even James's envoys, were met with blank stares or accusations. "You don't belong here," she muttered more than once, her voice a dry rasp. "You're not real." And then came the silences. Entire hours passed without a word. She wouldn't blink, wouldn't move, just stared at the far wall, eyes glazed but wide open. Servants placed mirrors beneath her nose to see if she still breathed. In her final week, Elizabeth descended into what modern physicians might call a catatonic state. The woman who had outwitted kings and papal decrees could no longer feed herself or form coherent sentences. Her mind was a shattered mirror reflecting nothing but fear. But her eyes kept moving, watching, searching, as if waiting for someone to come back or to take her away. By March 23, 1603, Queen Elizabeth I was no longer the ruler of England. She was its dying ghost. She had stopped speaking altogether. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Every few minutes, her body would jerk violently, as if pulled by invisible hands. Her bed, now permanently soaked in sweat and urine, had to be changed twice daily, though Elizabeth refused to leave it. She hadn't eaten in 4 days. Even water, gently spooned to her lips, was met with clenched teeth. But the most haunting detail came from the women who stayed at her side. They said her eyes never closed. For 4 straight days, Elizabeth stared, her head blinking rarely, sleeping not at all. When her ladies begged her to lie back, to rest, to pray, she simply shook her head. "Must I?" she whispered once. "Must I die so?" Those were her last known words. Doctors were summoned, then priests, then both. None could agree on a diagnosis: fever, infection, cancer, madness. Her body bore the marks of all of them. A purple rash had now spread to her chest. Her tongue was so swollen she couldn't speak. Her fingertips had turned dark, almost black, likely from lack of circulation. Her belly had bloated unnaturally, and her eyes, once fire and wit, were now glassy and unseed. And then, early on March 24th, as a freezing rain pelted the palace roof, the Queen's breathing changed. It was the death rattle, wet, gurgling, involuntary. Each breath sounded like drowning. Archbishop Whitgift was brought in for last rites. He held her hand, now thin as twigs, skin like parchment, and asked if she believed in Christ. Elizabeth could not answer, but her fingers, weak as they were, squeezed his once at 3 a.m. Her body shuddered once more and then stopped. After 44 years on the throne, the Queen of England was dead, but the horror was not over. Almost immediately, her body began to change. The color drained from her face, replaced with a waxy, greenish pallor. Her stomach distended. Fluid leaked from her mouth and nose. The smell, already foul, intensified rapidly. The windows were thrown open, despite the cold. Her ladies-in-waiting burned herbs and incense. But it was no use. Her corpse had begun to rot faster than anyone expected. Panicked attendants called for embalmers, but due to Elizabeth's wishes for privacy and the late hour, preparations had not been made. By dawn, the court had to admit the truth. England's Virgin Queen could not be displayed. She would not lie in state. She would not be seen again. She had to be hidden. And that's exactly what they did. The bedchamber was sealed. The body wrapped hastily in tar-soaked cloth. Orders were given. Rumors were suppressed. The public was told she died peacefully, but those inside the room knew better. Elizabeth I did not pass like a monarch. She died like a woman haunted by power, by guilt, and perhaps by the ghosts she couldn't silence. What happened after Queen Elizabeth's death was perhaps even more disturbing than her final breath. Within hours, her corpse had begun to bloat grotesquely. The belly swelled, the skin turned green and purple, and fluids leaked through the mattress and onto the chamber floor. The scent of decay, already potent, became unbearable. Court attendants reported vomiting in the hallway outside her door. Some claimed they heard strange popping sounds from within the chamber, a sign of internal gas buildup rupturing soft tissue. But Elizabeth could not be buried yet. There was no prepared coffin, no embalm plan, no public announcement. England was about to transition power to a foreign King James VI of Scotland, and the Queen's death needed to be managed with absolute control. So the Privy Council did what monarchies do best: they lied. The public was told that Elizabeth had died peacefully in her sleep after a short illness. The court was ordered to continue operating as usual. Bells were not tolled. Mourning was delayed. Meanwhile, behind sealed doors, the Queen's body was wrapped in layer after layer of waxed cloths soaked in vinegar and tar. An emergency embalming to halt the visible collapse. But it wasn't enough. When the body was finally placed in a makeshift coffin 3 days later, the leaking had already stained the shrouds. The wax had split from the internal gases. A black, oily liquid had pooled at the base. Servants handling the transfer were sworn to silence. A few later confessed, decades on, that the Queen's features were unrecognizable. Her eyes had sunk so deep that her eyelids collapsed inward. Her jaw had dislocated. Even her burial was altered. The grand lying-in state at Whitehall, once planned with Tudor precision, was cancelled. Elizabeth's coffin was kept closed at all times. The portrait laid on top did all the work, an idealized image of a queen, untouched by death. But beneath the satin and heraldry lay a body so ravaged by illness and secrecy, it could no longer be shown to the world. The final legacy of Queen Elizabeth I was preserved not by truth, but by silence.